the militias, which is in Mexico, which my paper is about, let me reflect a little bit more on some of the larger issues. And in fact, the often embraced narrative in Latin America that there is so much crime in Latin America because there is so much drug trafficking. And this is, in fact, also the reason for the particularly violent nature of crime. I just came back from 2 months in Asia, spending a good chunk dealing with East Asia. And I often point out to my Latin American interlocutors that there is as much drug production, trafficking, and perhaps more consumption of drugs in East Asia as there is in Latin America. Yet crime there is highly nonviolent. The drug traffickers behave in starkly different ways than they behave in Latin America. Malaysia is going through a crime crisis. Their homicides have just risen from 1.1 per 100,000 to 1.2. That is seen as a huge crisis. In Latin America, we are talking about homicide rates on the order of 20, 30, 40, 80, 100, occasionally 200 per 100,000. Orders of magnitude different. And Malaysia is unique in this crisis mode, but it's not unique in how nonviolent all kinds of criminality, including organized criminality, including drug trafficking, are in East Asia. And that's not the new phenomenon. It's a phenomenon that's been the case for a long time. And so we need to ask ourselves, why do drug traffickers, why do criminals behave differently under different circumstances? And here is where my theme, to some extent, links to Doug's, where Doug was focusing on the criminalized states where elites use crime for its purposes. I would argue that it's very much a pattern throughout Latin America. It's not just the case in the most extreme cases of Venezuela, but there is a broader issue of social contract and rather a comfort, long-term comfort, with outsourcing certain domains or certain physical spaces to criminal groups, be this Jamaica, be it Brazil, be it at a very fundamental level, very much of the struggle of Colombia. And conversely, society is, even as Latin Americans today point to crime as their number one concern, society in Latin America is very comfortable with crime. There is much of acceptance of some types of criminality. Crime is a mechanism of social advancement. Crime is a mechanism of access to socioeconomic goods, to social mobility, and it's only under some circumstances when then the response is one of rejecting, and particularly rejecting the violence. And it is indeed here where the issue of how security is provided presents an even far deeper privatization than what you alluded to, Ines. One aspect of the privatization is the rise of private security companies to whom elites have access to, and hence can punt or continue to be disinterested in the state building and social contract project. But the flip side of that is that, of course, security for the poor is equally privatized. Security is delivered by the criminals, by gangs, by criminal groups. And it's only the middle class that is really stuck with having the police, deeply problematic police often, as being their security providers. And the middle class has yet not really been, by and large, able to effectively demand substantial improvements in policing. Even as almost every police force in Latin America now says that they do community policing, regardless what they do. So the one other element of privatization security is, of course, militias. They are not a new phenomenon in Latin America. They are not a new phenomenon in Mexico. Just like in other parts of Latin America, in Colombia, militias in Mexico go back decades and centuries and have often been used as a tool by caciques, by state institutions in fighting the Zapatistas, in fighting other insurgency in previous decades. But what we are seeing today is perhaps a rise of somewhat different militias, those who arguably emerge spontaneously, at least in some parts of Guerrero and Michoacán, but which nonetheless very quickly become instrumentalized both by political actors, by security forces, and also by other criminal groups. So even if the original militias in Mexico can arguably have their justification as being protectors of the population against organized crime. So, for example, emerging against the Templarios, and the Templarios at one point would claim they emerged in response to La Familia Michoacana, etc. Very quickly, they do not remain a controlled entity. Their overwhelming tendency is to become predatory and abusive, and often taking over some of the rackets that they claimed their justification was to combat. And that's not a story that's unique to Latin America. That's the case indeed with militias in many other spaces, certainly in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, various parts of sub-Saharan Africa. Society might be willing to tolerate them if the state is arguably deficient, particularly when society is used to looking to privatized solution, to non-public solution, to major public goods deficiencies, such as insecurity. But it is one that is profoundly unsatisfactory and that very quickly starts producing even greater problems than the original problem that they're combating. And even and Mexico again is not unique. We are starting to see the rise of militias, quote unquote rise in Venezuela, anti-crime militias. But of course, much of the Chavez project in his police reform was to really tear up police as a corrupt, efficient, but nonetheless functioning institution, and to socialize it and create instead people's militias, which then would fail to deliver any security, and hence now the rise of a new form of militias in Venezuela. And if you look at Peru, the militias that were originally stood up against the Senderistas, the Rondas Campesinas, have not persisted in their militia form, but have often become non-state entities ruling territories, such as drug production territories, Monzon, with as much anti-state agenda as any population protection agenda. The Mexican state has oscillated in its response to the militias from negligence to crackdown, the crackdown that it could not implement, to efforts to co-opt and incorporate the militias in some sort of structures with very unequal effects, to ultimately, essentially, policy of apathy, which is where we are today, particularly in Guerrero, far more so even than in Michoacán. In Michoacán, the so-called rural corps that consist of some of the militias have been created, but it is highly questionable of how much control the state maintains, in fact, over the rural corps. But certainly it's better there than in Guerrero, where despite the abstinence Plan Guerrero, the state continues to be far more out of control of the state and controlled in various localities by various other actors. And in that sense, I would argue that the state response is certainly better than just wholesale embrace of the militias. The Mexican state has tried to grapple with how to deal with this phenomenon, though it's not been very successful so far. And let me conclude by suggesting then that this goes to the fundamental issues that makes Latin America quite different, even in the crime sector, from much of East Asia, that I started with, that the sense of who governs, who delivers public goods is fundamentally, often fundamentally different. Certainly, even in East Asia, organized crime groups have political capital. They deliver public goods, they arbitrate, they deliver rules. But the degree and extent, arguably, is far lesser than the degree and extent in Latin America. But But the challenge is one of will the social contract with the youth bulge, with the demographic dividend that Inez was talking about, will it then result in more fundamental restructuring of accountability in a very broad sense, in the social contract sense? Or will we continue seeing that security as the key public good and other public goods will be mitigated and delivered by other actors, whether they are militias or whether they are criminal groups themselves? And would that make the space for the Russians another very comfortable space to operate with, or a very complicated space to operate with? Arguably also that state social contract questions continue to be equally unresolved in Russia, and the happy merger of crime and politics in Russia is as much a happy merger as it is fundamental failure of state building in the country.
Thank you very much. So to round up the authors, we have Brian Fonseca from Florida International University, who's going to speak about U.S. policy in the hemisphere influencing the state and beyond.
Thank you. First, let me thank NDU, Mike, and the team out here for putting this together. It's certainly an honor to be among you. So there are some severe disadvantages in being the last speaker, and that's one that when you have such a prestigious and dynamic cast, the expectations get set extremely high. And second, I have the added pressure of standing between you and the cocktail reception. So I'm going to try to make my remarks brief. At the same time, there is a key benefit, and that is you're able to sort of take the stage inspired. So what I want to do today is kind of talk in sort of generalities, an approach that we put together in terms of thinking about U.S. policy in the region. So I want to present some of the ideas encompassed in the work that I did with Dr. Frank Mora. Dr. Frank Mora, many of you know Frank, the former Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Western Hemisphere, currently the director of the Kimberly Green Center for Latin American and Caribbean, the Center for the Latin American and Caribbean Center at FIU. He was my co-author, and essentially we put forth a vision for U.S. policy that emphasizes the importance of non-state actors in deepening hemispheric relations. Right, so we argue ultimately that the role of the U.S. government must evolve from that of a primary actor to a designer and an implementer of an enabling environment most conducive to the continued growth of non-state relationships throughout the hemisphere. U.S. policy must match an evolving strategic environment. It must be tailored to the increasingly pronounced differences that we see across the region, and it must leverage the full range of actors, state, non-state, and individuals. So I've centered my brief comments just sort of around, sort of talking about the strategic environment and perhaps positing some approaches to how we would strengthen relations beyond the state. First of all, I think we need to start with, sort of the state of U.S. Latin American relations today. And this is hotly debated, certainly in our community. But I believe that, U.S. Latin American relations today are strong. And more importantly, they're built on a broad base of sophisticated relationships that extend well beyond the state. U.S. Latin American relations are built on common culture, common values, and increasingly common interests. U.S. Latin American relations encompass far more than what we often see in the media, right? So the number of presidential visits to the region, or when you start to compare our engagement in the hemisphere with that of our engagement in the Middle East, or the rise of emerging powers, drugs, immigration, etc. I believe that these are largely outdated measures to sort of assess, the complexity and depth of U.S. Latin American relations today. It's only been really the last few decades that U.S. policy towards the region began to take into consideration key elements influencing these relations, such as increasing global integration of the Americas, the multiplicity and diversity of relations within the region, within the hemisphere, and really the growing differentiation among nations in the Americas, including their willingness, by the way, to partner with the United States. So when you think about our interests, right, deepening democratic principles, improving human security, and creating opportunities for growth, economic growth and integration continue to be central to ensuring regional stability and advancing U.S. interests in the hemisphere. Now, this is not a departure from, the policies articulated by previous administrations, and nor should it be. Rather, I think that the difference lies in the U.S.'s capacity to expand influence in the increasingly interconnected global context in which U.S.-Latin American relations take place today. On this increasingly crowded global stage, the U.S. government must be competitive, right? We must offer a vision of universal values that is unifying, compelling, and appealing to citizens across the hemisphere. We must, sort of, given our shared histories, similar cultures, increasing economic and social ties, we must assert our leadership in developing partnerships with others in the hemisphere. As articulated in the National Security Strategy, the U.S. government must lead, or the U.S. must lead with strength, conviction, strategic vision, and with willing and capable partners using all instruments of national power, diplomatic, information, intelligence, military, and economic, really to enhance the whole of society relationships. The dynamic strategic environment that characterizes hemispheric relations today is not often clearly understood by those who continue to have a state-centric view of a state-centric understanding of the region and of U.S. policy. The need for policy to reflect and respond to this rapidly evolving context is paramount if Washington is to continue deepening ties and strengthening influence in the region. Globalization continues to force the region to rapidly adapt to political, economic, and social currents, and improvements in access to information provide individual citizens with better connectivity and, in many cases, greater influence over their respective governments. The recent case of Guatemala serves as a fascinating example of the role civil society can play in sort of holding its public officials accountable, of course, with the support of the international community. Or you can take the case in Paraguay, in which students demanding sort of change within the most prestigious university in Paraguay was able to sort of depose the president of the university. And by the way, that was no small feat, and in a place like Paraguay. And the fact that private businesses and citizens started to collect goods in order to sustain the protest kind of gives you a sense of the increasing influence. I do want to sort of make a note that I'm not saying that the state is irrelevant either. It's important to highlight that in world politics, the state remains the most important actor, particularly in the area of security and the establishment and maintenance of international norms and practices. Bilateralism, multilateralism remain critical in exerting influence. However, policymakers have yet to truly appreciate and leverage the impact of non-state actors on state-society relations. Businesses, religious organizations, and social movements and their structured networks across borders are impacting international politics in profound ways. In terms of U.S.-Latin American relations, dense interactions among non-state actors have become true determinants of hemispheric relations. And, one of the stats that we sort of evaluate is if you take the 1970s, for example, and you start to look at the outflows of development assistance, nearly 80% of those outflows were coming from the U.S. government. If you look at that today, 80% of the outflows going to support development assistance is largely from faith-based organizations, businesses, social movements, and alike. And so I think that at the same time, we need to sort of think about how we frame our policy to capitalize on sort of that, the power of that flow. So how do we leverage it, right? So Chris Sabatini has pointed out in his recent work that these, the interactions between these different networks and these organizations essentially are outstripping formal state relations and helping move governments in directions that state bureaucracies would not normally move themselves. For example, non-state actors continue to drive many states to acknowledge and address endemic corruption, human rights violations, and a wide range of other socioeconomic inequalities. And this is, again, advancing the point that you made about the penetration of civil society. The disruption the distribution and diffusion of power from traditional centers of political and economic authority has heightened the capability of non-state actors and individuals to shape and influence global affairs. With regard to U.S. Latin American relations, states continue to play a dominant role, but other actors in their networks are enhancing interconnectivity, leading to more complex and dynamic inter-American relationships. And so it's for this reason that the U.S. government should lead and coordinate a whole-of-nation effort that places emphasis on the power of non-state actors and individual citizens. These connections are fluid and dynamic, and allowing states to engage and collaborate with non-state actors to achieve mutual objectives. For instance, the growth in public-private partnership programs in the economic and social realms. Two examples would be the 100,000 Strong in the Americas program, which Department of State boasts sort of contributes to a 16% increase in their engagement with the Hemisphere, right? Or the Connecting the Americas 2020, the electricity generation program. Programs in which Washington works with the private sector and the community leaders in the U.S. and across the Hemisphere are the most dynamic kinds of contacts occurring today and go a long ways in deepening inter-American connectivity. So the U.S. government must leverage and coordinate these actors and opportunities, since these are the types of interactions that offer the most effective means of achieving U.S. interests and influence in the new inter-American strategic context. Another important characteristic of the strategic environment today is the growing convergence on key issues and subsequently interests. For instance, the 2003 Declaration on Security of the Americas integrated different perspectives regarding security threats, priorities that included terrorism, corruption, illicit trafficking, and weapons proliferation. However, differences remain as to the perceptions of severity and the appropriate means to address these challenges, but a consensus persists around these threats nonetheless, more than a decade after the Declaration. Since then, the consensus has expanded to focus on key issues including energy, climate change, inequality, and social inclusion, crime and violence, and of course, competitiveness. And perhaps it's time for us to reconvene our hemispheric partners and sort of evolve that declaration on the security of the Americas. And despite the political and ideological differences that emerged in the new century in impending inter-American collaboration in some areas, the consensus and opportunities for mutual collaboration continue to mature, in part thanks to the efforts by social and economic entities such as religious organizations, universities, human rights organizations, and their determination to keep these issues at the forefront of the hemispheric agenda. So countries in the hemisphere continue to make great strides in their political, economic, and social developments, and all in the context of an increasingly interconnected multipolar world. However, there are some differences among countries in terms of demographics, economy, territory, social development, and institutional capacity to confront these challenges and opportunities of globalization. So comparing, for example, the economic size and institutional capacity of Honduras to Brazil or Chile underscores these differences. And we started to think about U.S. policy. We have to tailor our policy to these pronounced differences. Now, democracy remains the most prevailing form of government, but the quality of democracy or democratic practices varies across the region. Progressive social initiatives over the last few decades have led to improvements in access to education and health reduction in poverty rates, as was pointed out, in most of South America. But the quality and access remains problematic, particularly in places like Central America. Progress, therefore, remains uneven across the hemisphere, and in some cases, we're seeing some reversals, producing greater differentiation than ever before. So, in other words, the increasing differentiation lies in the capacity and performance of states to deliver governance and development. Again, comparing state capacities and performance between Chile and Guatemala, for example, in delivering public goods effectively, particularly in the areas of citizen security, the main challenge facing Guatemala and most of Central American neighbors, highlights the differentiation that exists in Latin America. So improving political and social institutions is, among the preeminent challenges facing the consolidation of democratic rule across the region. Recent social protests in Brazil, Chile, Guatemala, and Honduras, for example, are signs of structural reforms, are signs that the structural reforms remain incomplete. In the end, the challenges to the region's democracy is far more fundamental than weak rule of law or bad infrastructure or poor schools. It's about state capacity and the political will to institute the necessary reforms. Despite important progress, Latin America's middle class is, of course, precarious. We talked about this. At best, they're an economic slump away from poverty. They have insecure jobs, weak purchasing power, and lack of access to quality education and health care for their children. But they also have rising expectations, and they have a new stake in the political process, which is vital. Increased access to uncensored information via social media and a voice that demands to be heard. This is what we're seeing coming out of the region today. So if this new middle class were to drop back into poverty, democratic governance could be further in peril. And additionally, downward trends in inequality and poverty have now leveled off, in large part because of emerging economic stagnation and again, pending structural reforms. In some countries like the Southern Cone and the Caribbean, poverty has begun to creep up. In Mexico, for example, we've seen the number of poor increase by more than 2 million since 2012. So, this is one of the last challenges I'll sort of conclude with, and I'll wrap up. But the key challenge I think that we've kind of assessed here is in most Latin America, and you can probably expand that to the hemisphere, is citizen security. And the question of citizen security is not associated with the threat necessarily of interstate conflict, which remains very low, despite legacies of territorial disputes. Rather, the nature of the threat is internal to states and involves illicit non-state actors and individuals. So those citizen insecurity affects us all. Again, thinking about the context of differentiation, it affects some significantly more than others. Argentina, Chile, Nicaragua, and Uruguay, for instance, have homicide rates of less than 8 per 100,000. Conversely, El Salvador, Venezuela, and Honduras recorded homicide rates of more than 60 per 100,000, the highest levels in the world, by the way. The same differentiation applies to other crimes like kidnapping, burglaries. Criminal organization gangs continue to proliferate in areas characterized by weak governance and high socioeconomic inequalities. And Colombia and Peru continue to fight decades-long insurgencies, albeit considerably weakened insurgencies. So to that end, we think about centering notions of security on the individual instead of the state, which is why in our paper we ascribe to the concept of human security. Now, U.S. government policy is critical in expanding and deepening U.S.-Latin American relations at the levels of interaction that we talk about in our paper, which is state, non-state, and individuals. But only the U.S. government is capable of defining and pursuing U.S. national interests, but it has to do so increasingly by using its instruments of national power to encourage and create the space that enable the density of societal interaction across all of society. So when we start to get policy prescriptive in our paper, we take the dime approach to sort of talk about how diplomatic, information, military, and economy can be used to sort of create space and bolster the capacity of non-state actors to affect the state. So, just to kind of wrap up, for far too long, experts and others that comment on U.S. policy towards Latin America have failed to align their analysis and policy recommendations with the ever more complex and dynamic nature of contemporary U.S.-Latin American relations. I find that critics often use outdated Cold War frameworks to suggest that the U.S. is losing ground in the region, whether they're alluding to China's growth in trade and investments or the recent diplomatic inroads by Russia in Iran, as Doug was pointing out. And I think it's dangerous to sort of utilize zero-sum approaches. I think that it ignores the complexity of hemispheric relations in the 21st century. Finally, pundits point to the dramatic decline in economic and military aid, or the absence of all-encompassing policy with an exciting moniker such as the Good Neighbor policy or the Alliance for Progress as proof that the United States is ignoring the region and therefore ceding influence to other actors. And I think that is quite far from the truth. In today's context, however, these are not the best and most effective indicators for measuring the true level of support for U.S. policies. The real action or impact is occurring below the state. At other levels of interaction where non-state actors and individuals such as universities, small to large companies, churches, transnational civil organizations, media, etc., interact with their counterparts throughout the hemisphere in an organic way, giving texture and meaning to U.S.-Latin American relations. The role of the U.S. government policy remains critical in hemispheric relations, providing the leadership and policy outlines, international agreements, and political legal framework through which U.S. as a nation engages the region. Globalization, technology, and the associated empowering of non-state actors in the Americas has created space for non-state actors and individuals to engage one another across borders in ways that make a difference in everyday citizens' lives. So it's for this reason that U.S. policy should focus on facilitating and expanding the interconnectivity via the full range of instruments of national power to create a context for strengthening partnerships and opportunities for mutual gain while enhancing U.S. interests and influence in the region. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, as you can see from the presentations of the authors of PRISM, It's a very diverse edition that really reflects a lot, not just the changing Western Hemisphere, but how complex and how layered a lot of the issues that touch security and prosperity have been. We started with Dr. Bustillo talking about the economic landscape of tremendous opportunity, which also was highlighted by Ambassador Pinzon, but more importantly, the challenges and the need to actually build consensus and find ways to really double down efforts in terms of education, economic development, which we talked about earlier, will actually deprive transnational criminal organizations and gangs from gaining a foothold in a lot of these marginalized communities. Then we heard from Doug about the role of Russia. Actually, is still continuing, a lot of its relationships from the past, but has also, as Doug and I have spent a lot of time looking at mafias and, more importantly, criminalized states, really take advantage of those same weaknesses of a lack of what we call a legitimate economic opportunity and have been able to permeate different parts of Latin America. Then we heard from Vanda how, sadly, because many states have been unable to control and provide citizen security, you've actually seen different elements in different parts of society, particularly in Mexico, take up arms themselves. We didn't talk about that, but it was the same with the autodefensas in the case of Colombia in the old days. Then Brian actually helped us take a look at how dynamic the region is. And more importantly, he spoke a lot about the drivers of globalization, which sadly governments and states no longer have a monopoly on, whether it's violence or information or actually economic development. So we always talk about non-state actors here at National Defense University. We always think of them as negative. So you're talking about the benevolent non-state actors when it comes to the private sector, the public sector, academia, and a lot of these social movements. And I think you're seeing a lot of the changes are driven by this technology and social media, whether it is the protests in Guatemala that mobilized unprecedented hordes of people to actually change the government. Now, the question is going to be, when these new governments come into power, how are they going to actually be able to affect change? So with that as a summary, we'll turn to the audience to see you all and see if you can identify yourselves, and then if you can actually direct your question to a specific author, that would be fantastic. Dr. Downey. And the microphone is coming to you.
Well, thank you all for making some very interesting points. And my question is actually for Vanda. And I apologize because I had to step out of your presentation for a little bit. But one of the points, and not so much on the issue of militias, but the point you made about Malaysia and Southwest Asia, that in spite of the fact that there are probably more drugs going on than in Latin America, that the violence is so much of magnitudes less than what's going on in this region. Could you talk a little bit about some lessons that we might put into this citizen security? Again, not so much in the area of militias, but in actions that might help us to address some of this incredible crime wave that is related to drugs in this region. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. The why is crime in East Asia, not South Asia, East Asia, so well behaved is, in my view, the fundamental question for criminologists, political sciences, public policy. And indeed, in some of my work, some forthcoming work, as well as previous one, I often argue that the purpose of law enforcement is to make good criminals. I'm well aware that's an extremely controversial statement, and I partially make it facetiously because of the shock value. And I would also be more specific to suggest that is particularly the case in transactional crimes, as opposed to predatory crimes, such as homicide or kidnapping or robbery, where clearly the predominant objective of the state and law enforcement needs to be to drive prevalence down. But to the extent that we see transactional crime in non-depletable goods like drugs, then the question is how to minimize the harm and threats that it poses to state and society, and why East Asia has been able to do it far better than Latin America. In my view, the fundamental difference is that police forces in East Asia have been able to retain deterrence capacity vis-à-vis organized crime groups. That is the fact, despite the fact that deals where police manages crime, allocates franchises, to what is the practice in Argentina, to what used to be the dominant practice in Mexico, persist there. And they persist in places like Indonesia, for example, for decades, since the inception of the country as a pirate republic. Again, if one were to be somewhat facetious, with criminals being key actors in the liberation of Indonesia through waves and waves of regime change. The big question is, has the police retained this capacity to moderate behavior, to structure turf wars to be far less violent and to subside far faster? And why have they been able to do so? Why has the often problematic relationship between crime and police not rotted the police law enforcement forces to the same extent as in Latin America? And frankly, I don't think I have a satisfactory answer. No one does. But thinking about that is then, in my view, the fundamental question that needs to take place. But the lesson I would draw then for Latin America is to focus on that, how to create deterrence capacity. It's not simply about suppressing flows. It's not simply about legalization, whether of drugs or other commodities. For example, logging is very violent in Brazil. Illegal logging as well as legal logging are very violent enterprises. So how to change behavior of criminal groups to be less pernicious, and how to resurrect deterrence capacity of law enforcement and justice to go back together, and how to do so in a way that does not simply resurrect authoritarianism. China has, for the past 2-3 years, gone through President Xi through extraordinarily anti-crime drive. Really, the extent and scope of various criminal enterprises that are being dismantled and feeling the punch of the state would be unimaginable in Latin America. And certainly the reaction would be one of great violence response, whereas there is not a peep in China. And lots of it is also touching communist and Politburo institutions. Now it is likely that over time we will see resurrection of the crime networks and around different set of actors. This is much about politics as it is about anti-crime. But nonetheless, the state has a capacity to do so, and criminals don't react with violent reprisal. Again, not something we would see in Latin America. However, I would never be the one to say that Latin America should become an authoritarian country like China. So how to resurrect the deterrence of law and police without then resorting to repression on that scale?
The question is, I'm Dr. Kuhn, and the question is for Dr. Bustillo. My problem is a little bit with the title, because we're talking about changing Western Hemisphere, and yet many of the changes, from my perspective, are due because of the changes in the world. If you look at the world demographics, 75% of the world population today lives in Asia and Africa, and the three Americas is about 14%. Now, given that, a lot of the problems that Brian was mentioning in terms of climate change, changes and so on, I believe that bring opportunities for this continent, if you want, in terms of critical infrastructures, which is the area that I emphasize, instead of the economics. And so my point to you is this: when you have a world that access to clean water it's really bad, access to food is really bad. In 2012, 6.6 million children died before the age of 5, which is an average of 18,000 children per day, or every day of the year. I mean, these numbers are incredible, and that's why I believe the order of magnitude when you have crime here versus there, but it's all part of the same world. In the global economy, there is a consequence. But I think from an opportunities point of view, I would like your opinion. when we open up instead of just thinking on the continent, but rather all the needs from outside, what that can generate for the continent.
Go ahead. Just press it on, yeah.
Thank you. Yes, you're right. I mean, I focused on Latin America and the Caribbean, but I'm glad you brought up the world economy, because much of the success in the years to come for Latin America and the Caribbean will depend on how it relates and the changes in terms of how it relates with the global economy. Because as you said, one of the changes that has been taking place is this shift from west to east, the increase of south-south linkages. And when you look at population trends, for example, yes, the opportunities that will open up, let's say, by population and in Asia in the years to come is huge. And I had not focused on trade before, but that opens up opportunities. I mean, if you look at what has happened in the last years in Latin America and the Caribbean, in the last years, many countries have now Asian countries as the number one trading partner. And the opportunities for growth in Latin America and the Caribbean will very much depend on changing the type of trade and investment relationship that the region has with China in particular. We export mostly commodities, we import manufactured goods, we're very vulnerable to the price of commodities and demand from Asia. So that's how the region changes its relationship with Asia. That's a big part. Another change that has been taking place in the world economy is, even though we live in an area of globalization, at the same time, from the point of view of trade and investment relationships, there's an increase in regionalism. Europe, Asia, and the Western Hemisphere. So I want to add that I truly believe that one pending task for Latin American and Caribbean countries is increasing ties within the Western Hemisphere. The opportunities for Latin American and Caribbean countries of benefiting from increased trade, investment, technology, exchanges, some of the things that Brian was talking about, is absolutely huge. So I would see that in the years to come, changing the relationship, the trading and investment relationship with Asia, particularly trying to diversify trade and investment relationships and taking advantage of the growing market in Asia. But at the same time, deepening trade ties and investment ties in the Western Hemisphere will be absolutely crucial for Latin America and the Caribbean. And you mentioned infrastructure. That's probably one of the pending tasks, huge pending tasks in the region. Right now we invest about 3.2% of GDP infrastructure investment. We need to invest much more. And that is an impediment, really, to economic growth. Infrastructure, logistics, investment in education, all are things that need to be undertaken in order to boost economic growth.
Thank you very much. We have a question way back here. To back.
Hello, my name is Mike Gufford. I'm a student with the College of International Security Affairs here at NDU. And this is for Dr. Feldbaum-Brown. The first part is more clarification for what I thought the essence of what you may have said in during your comments, and then followed up by my question where it leads to. And again, just to make sure I got this right, during your comments, you said that the greater acceptance of crime by the poor, and I may have this wrong, has led to a greater acceptance of gangs and criminal organizations and the security they can provide against the police due to the weak social contract between them and the state. And if this is so, would you say this is symptomatic of a state that has ignored the civil society needs of the poor?
Yes, indeed. It is really in the recent 2-3 decades where the state in Latin America is fundamentally grappling, confronting with issues of human security. And it's not what the state is used to provide, and frequently for long what the state has not been interested in providing. State in much of the region, and of course I'm grossly generalizing across different countries, but in much of the region the state, even when it was quote-unquote democratic has also been highly exclusionary. And large parts of marginalized populations have been either purposefully or by default left to be governed by others. And again, this is not just in places like Colombia at the macro level, but in the slums of Brazil, in Jamaica, large parts of the periphery, the so-called brown areas. So then there is now more of a push, much more of a push and demand by citizens to have the state deliver, including those that have been historically marginalized, to have a voice and have the state deliver. And the state is struggling with that, including struggling with that in terms of resources and then in terms of taxation. And it is not yet obvious that the social bargain has been restructured fundamentally. There is far greater elite acceptance that the state cannot be as exclusionary or as narrow as it has been. And so even in places like Colombia, we are seeing real struggles for the Santos administration to maintain the security tax, and there is much backing against it. UPP, a much better designed program in Rio, is struggling to find and resource what it really requires. And so citizens are demanding it more so than they were before. The state struggles both in conceptualization and particularly in the resource base. And often then the result is frustration and then continuing looking out to other non-state solutions, some of which might be very good, the rise of civil society, perhaps the rise of business partnerships, such as in parts of Mexico or for that matter, Medellin, and others which is pernicious, which is governance continually delivered by gangs and criminal groups.
In the back row right there. She's right there in front.
June Vidal with the Congressional Research Service. This is a question for Inez, but Vanda may have a comment because I know she knows a lot about Colombia. I was really interested in your comments about the demographic dividend, and I wanted to have you speak a little bit more specifically about Colombia and where it is at in its demographic transition, especially as we look towards a reconstruction process, if that comes about.
So if I understood correctly, it's the demographic dividend in Colombia. Yeah. It's countries are in general in different stages. For example, in countries in the region, Chile and Cuba, by the way, are countries that are more advanced in the demographic dividend. In Chile and Cuba, it is expected to end by 2025. In the case of Guatemala is in the other extreme, and the demographic dividend will arise much later. That's because of changes in fertility rates, etc. It will end about 2070. In the case of the other Central American countries, it's around 2050, 2060. In the case of Colombia, it's between 2040 and 2050. We have within ICLAC the Latin American Center on Demography, and I could provide you with all the information that they have by country and a clear analysis of the implications by country. What is interesting is that this is a unique opportunity, and it's a unique opportunity because you have young people, and it's a window of opportunity until the share of older and dependence increases. So it's an opportunity to invest. And this has happened in other parts of the world. For example, in Southeast Asia, when they went and transitioned through the demographic dividend by investing in education, there was a clear benefit in terms of increasing the productive potential of youth and benefits to economic growth. Now, in terms of the opportunities are because you have you want to have skilled labor in the workforce. With respect to the second part of your question, I really do not know what implications it would have. I would need to think a little bit more about that.
Were you asking, though, June, about the dividend immediately in terms of the peace process? Because we've been estimating, well, there's a couple of costs, right, to actually demobilize the FARC it's actually going to be a big cost, and we haven't really estimated, nor have the Colombians, what that's going to look like to retrain, repurpose, and actually disarm. And then the other piece is, what's that going to do that the security forces, whether it's police or military, are going to have to readjust? Because the purpose will be a counter-crime purpose as opposed to a counterinsurgency. So I know that there are several people who are looking at that and trying to extrapolate. And then the other exogenous, which are much more positive, is the signing of the free trade agreement with the United States, and then more importantly, what the prospects are, which we didn't talk about, which is TPP, which is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which will bring all the trade and investment that Luis Kuhn and Ines were talking about. It's so hard to extrapolate what that's going to look like, right? Oh, that microphone's right there next to you. We should have asked Ginzo.
I guess what I'm thinking about is really education in Colombia and strengthening its secondary education. And this is to move out of being a commodity-based economy into a more skill-based economy, and having this kind of opportunity when you're going to get, hopefully, some bump from a peace dividend as well.
Right, that's right. Vanda's been looking at this. Yes, sure. Mm-hmm.
I'm glad you mentioned education, because in the past years, throughout the region, in Colombia included, there have been huge advances in education. Well, you look at educational attainment in primary school, secondary school, university, etc. But in most of the studies done for the region, of course, there's still a need to increase educational attainment, mostly in the case of high school education. But as I think it was mentioned before, most of the emphasis needs to be put into the quality of education. And when you look at the results for Latin American and Caribbean countries in terms of the PISA tests worldwide, we rank very low in terms of the quality of education. And another area that needs to be, we need to put a lot of attention, and that's an area where increased cooperation with the United States would be extremely beneficial, is in the area of science, technology, and innovation. When you look at all estimates in terms of research and development as percentage of GDP, in terms of the number of scientists in the region, etc., once again, we rank very low compared to other regions in the world, and of course compared to developed countries. And that's another area where the investments need to be done right now in order to be able to reap the benefits in the years to come. So innovation, science and technology, I wish that would be an area that would get emphasized in terms of the collaboration within the Western Hemisphere.
I don't know if Brian wanted to add on to that, because I know that you and Dr. Moore have been looking at that kind of academic peer-to-peer civic sector engagement.
Yeah, I mean, so one example is, of course, the 100,000 strong in the Americas.
Just press the microphone.
So one example is, of course, the 100,000 strong in the Americas, where, again, the latest statistic is we've seen a 16% increase in engagement through that program alone. And, right now we're still trying to, work through the mechanics of the types of curriculum that we sort of facilitate in terms of the cross-educational or the bilateral academic exchanges. But I know that there is a push for STEM and incorporating STEM into it. And then we got to think about sort of the students that come up from the region versus the students go down down to the region in terms of the exchanges, because it's oftentimes we're seeing it sort of disconnected. It's cultural exchanges, really the social sciences sort of going into the region, and then the physical sciences in terms of coming up from the region. So there's still, I think, some work that needs to be done in programs like that, but those programs tend to foster and facilitate those. And that's where you need the private sector also to jump in, right? Because the extension from higher education is, of course, jobs and to move into employment. And, private sector could be a really, useful and critical source to fund, right, sort of the extension of those programs and again, institutionalize those programs.
I just add two quick comments. One is on what just Brian ended. Jobs are ultimately what growth needs to be generating. That's particularly true for Colombia, which often has had capital-intensive growth, but very little job creation for many reasons, one of which is quality of education, which the elite has access to excellent, superlative education, but the vast majority of people from very early on will face either no educational opportunity or so poor that they will ultimately not be able to effectively compete. But the other is taxation systems. Part of the land reform, rural reform that Colombia promises in the FARC deal to undertake really needs to be thinking very differently about taxing capital and taxing land and labor, so that the growth starts producing job and not simply capital accumulation, not privileging land lying fallow. And that gets into those very, very difficult issues of vested interest, who still holds political and economic power, changing the social contract.
We probably have time for one more question, and the director. Here, he's coming from your right.
This is for Doug. I couldn't let the opportunity to follow up on the Russians pass by. Those of us who served in the field for the last decade or so have been reporting on this anecdotally, and it always smelled like we were reporting on a chess game, but we're never able to quite put the pieces together. And what you're telling us today, it sounds like not only is it a chess game, but a sort of three-dimensional hybrid chess game that's being played out here. So if we take the chief of staff's sort of policy, a strategy that he's evolving on this, would you dare to extrapolate how this might play out to the point where they might find U.S. pressure points that would cause us to pay the same attention to our near-end border as the Russians are having to pay attention in Ukraine and Georgia and elsewhere?
Well, I think it's aspirational largely at this point what they want to do, and they talk about it a lot. But I think, and one of the things I left out in my formal talks, the other place where they're very active, in which we get into some pressure points that we don't think about very often, is in the financial field. One of the things they put a great deal of interest in is opening financial relationships across the region, in part to avoid the sanctions by the EU and in the U.S., but I think also in ways that have helped, particularly Venezuela, launder billions of dollars. There's the Ebro Finance Bank, which is owned in 49.999% of that bank is owned by the Fondo Nacional para el Desarrollo of Venezuela, which is supposed to be building houses. Ebro Finance is a conglomeration of sanctioned Russian banks. And into that bank, in one instance that was publicly documented, $14 billion disappeared. Just when Venezuela was at its most vulnerable, they had no cash reserves, and they put almost everything they had left in their cash reserves into a bank where it then disappeared. An interesting phenomenon. You have the Banca Privada de Andorra, which is another case where the U.S. Treasury in May declared that bank a primary money laundering concern. When we were asked to look at some of their Latin American branches, they had 3 in Panama that we looked at, and one in Uruguay. And that, what the Treasury Department said publicly at that point is that PDVSA had laundered $2 billion at least in the 2 years they had looked at the Banca de Andorra's books, that they had laundered $2 billion to offshore companies, etc. When we looked at the Panamanian structure, there were all the PDVSA officials, there were all the high, a lot of senior Venezuelan officials and all. So I think they're creating mechanisms to launder lots of money. The other thing they're extremely interested in, I think personally, and I think this is becoming the general consensus, the Nicaraguan canal will never happen. That was never intended to be an actual event, but what they will get out of it are deep water ports that the Russians very much want. They're getting the airstrips out of it that the Russians very much want. And I think the aspiration of making us pay enough attention to stop being able to do things with NATO is probably not going to happen, but I think that they're positioning themselves in ways which, and then say they talk an enormous amount about asymmetrical warfare in their own internal doctrine, and particularly in the Gerasimov doctrine about that's why they need all of these multiple factors going on simultaneously across the entire theater of the enemy, is what they call it. It's an entire theater of war operation. So I think they're putting some resources into it. I think they're making some significant advances. I don't think they're at the point yet where they can do what they want to do, but I think that they have, because they have backing of actual states, not individuals. That's what I think is the main difference. I think if you look at what they talk about, when you have multiple states cooperating with them on a project and them cooperating with multiple states in their criminal enterprise, I think that's a game changer. It means you have access to banks. It means you have access to official documents. It means you have access to shipping registries. You may have access to airline registries. You have access to all kinds of things that states can provide you. And I think that is where the alliance gets very dangerous, and I think it will probably become more dangerous as time goes forward.
Thank you very much. So with that, thank you all for literally spending the afternoon with us looking at the changing environment here in the Western Hemisphere. I thought that we kicked off a really engaging conversation with Ambassador Pinzon and General Kelly. And now you have a little bit of a teaser, a preview of what all the different chapters are in the forthcoming edition of PRISM. And I'm supposed to remind you there's a little form for you to all fill out if you'd like to get a copy of PRISM. And on behalf of the National Defense University Center for Complex Operations, the William J. Perry Center for Hemispheric Defense Studies, and even more importantly, the NDU Foundation, who is hosting our reception, I want to thank you for your presence in vivo, as we call it, in person and online. And please join me in thanking our fantastic authors who shared their analysis of what we call the changing Western Hemisphere. Thank you very much. South Atrium, where we'll be able to join and get to mingle, and more importantly, enjoy a